Okay. Hi, everyone. So today, I think we have a couple of KEPs to discuss. One for the Workload API beta from Matt, and one for the pod group API KEP, and another one is for the integration with the job API. These are the three caps that we are thinking of, like having conversation around them today. If you have anything else, please feel free to add it to the agenda. Um, Matt, please, if you can start.
Okay, which one do you want me to start with?
I think the workload beta cap.
So I just opened it, so we have the PRR written and sent for review. And we are still converging on the decision regarding the workload reference. And until we have that, I believe, like, we first need to agree on that, and then we'll be like writing down all the details in the cap. So I would say like the end of the week, something like that. But the idea is like more or less remains the same as was presented in the doc and like discussed last week. So we are not changing much in the workload API. We just want to rename some fields to address the ambiguity that we have. So basically, the workload stays as the policy. One of the changes that happened last week, and we haven't discussed it yet, is that we are shifting towards the inline model. So basically, there were like a lot of concerns from also like people in this meeting on the doc that in Kubernetes we have this pattern of pod template and pod, which is this copy on create, right? You have a pod template. When pod is created, the template is copied into the pod, and if you later change the template, it doesn't affect already existing pods. And it was like misleading what we initially introduced in the doc because we called it template, but it acted more as something that doesn't really exist in Kubernetes, more like a policy. One of the biggest concerns about this was the blast radius, right? Basically, this policy acts as a global config. So whenever you change it, you are actually changing the policy in one moment for all the podgroup instances. And that was like the main reason we went with the inline model. So basically the copy on create. So now we have the podgroup template and the policy is copied into the podgroup instance. And that's actually the policy used by the scheduler. So that's the change. But from the workload API perspective, actually it's only like renaming podgroup to podgroup template because the bigger change is in the podgroup object, right? That Heba you are creating owning a cap for. And we are still discussing as I said, the how to change workload reference to basically allow us promoting to beta and also making sure that we end up with a clean API for the future. So I guess that's it about the workload API changes. And obviously, like for beta promotion, we'll need more things. We are working on the workload scheduling cycle, on the delay preemption, like all of the criteria that we already have in the gang scheduling cap. Yeah, and I guess like that the remaining thing from the dog is the podgroup API that I believe Heba you can cover, right? Because you are owning the cap for that. So if you want, or if you want me to continue.
Yeah, I can go to the pod group API. I opened the cap. There's a couple of blockers for this cap to be to be fully ready for review, which is, as Matt mentioned now, it was the inline bot group. So I think we had this. I updated this a little bit in the cap. Please feel free to see if this is what we are targeting. I'm still, I'm still not sure. Okay, so if like I'm still like a little bit confused that okay, the pod group now will be just copied from the template to the pod group. Okay, um, are we allowed to update anything in the template? No, it's still immutable, right?
So at least in 136, yes, it's still immutable. And but like eventually, I think we all agree, and we have discussions on the doc that some settings, like for example min count, will need to be immutable, right? To support some like cases like scaling up and ensuring that the system remains in a stable state, right? So we don't have this problem with min count being different than actual number of pods and like figuring out what is the semantics for that, like what scheduler should do, etc. So eventually we need to make it mutable. But I guess for 136, the best path is to make it immutable and just proceed with the plan that we have. And like for 137, hopefully we'll make it mutable, both for template and for the pod group.
Okay. So this is one. The second one, the second thing for the inline pod group, we will get the pod to have the like the kind as a pod group template by default.
So like the workload reference, as I said, we are still discussing it with Tim.
So it's not. Okay.
So
it's not fun.
I think we'll likely avoid the kind because it's not something
it's one of the options, but like we have like I think we didn't like we started a doc with Matt like earlier today. We just didn't yet share it because the goal was to meet with Tim as soon as possible to get his feedback from like API approval perspective. We will share it like I guess tomorrow because we need to flesh it out. That was like very drafty for now, but like we effectively have 4 options. All of them are not perfect, and like we are still trying to look for something that we kind of like.
Okay. Okay. Just let me know because I updated the KEP to have this kind option, which is, to be honest, like I feel like it's a little bit, yeah, it's it has pros and cons. So yeah, let me know so we can see what's the next step. Okay, about the job integration with the Workload API, I just opened the like the PR today. So I'm not sure if you have time to have like a quick look or not, but basically what I really appreciate from you is the like to review like the first thing if we agree that the alpha deliverables this is like we agree on the alpha deliverables. This is what I wanted to say. Because like it will be very limited like option for the job, just the index, just the parallel index job to have the workload and pod group created by default, and still we don't have any way to opt out from this feature. And I'm not sure if like this is okay or not, or if we need to discuss it more, or we should just postpone it to 1.37. What else? I think that's it. But just make sure, like keep in mind that once user, like decide to try this and they have the workload and both group, it will be so hard for us to roll it back, like to take it away from them. So we just need to make sure if we need to have any opt-out feature, I would love to discuss this because I feel like it's a missing feature. It's a missing thing in the kit.
Yeah, I guess we need to have an opt-out, right?
Yeah.
Even if we make only like the job integration available in alpha and it's like off by default, I think we need to have an idea like because eventually we'll need opt-out. I cannot imagine like enabling this feature by default without having opt-out, and we should have this decision now, right? To make sure we are. It may impact, for example, the API design, right? So yeah, we definitely should discuss this in KEP, unless like someone already has some ideas about this and like put more thoughts here.
Yeah, I think Kevin.
Yeah, I thought you already mentioned that we were going to do if owner references are set, we skip. We don't assume gang scheduling. So if someone's owning the job, we would just not create the workload, which I think probably should work. The only issue will be I'm not sure how you support this without breaking elastic index jobs. If we're saying elastic index job is not supported for gang scheduling, but you will automatically create a workload if parallelism is greater than one. I think so. Maybe you probably do need an API. It's to actually key off the fact that we're going to forbid elastic index jobs for gang scheduling. But
Elastic job is not supported for this release, but we are going to discuss, like how to support it in the future. This is one. The second thing for the owner, for the ownership, what I mentioned in the KEP that if if there is, like a higher level controller has already created this workload, the job controller will not create the workload. But I believe we cannot depend on this as an opt-out um, option. Yeah, go ahead.
So the way that I was envisioning opt-out, the question is if it's good enough or not. But it solves both cases. It's effectively you as a user, if you want to opt out, you create your own workload that sets like basic policy on whatever. And effectively when creating and use it as your like user provided workload and overwriting the default. So like that works in all cases. That kind of pattern already is like works. That works as an opt out for the elastic jobs use case, because like you create your own to reflect that you don't want gang scheduling. That is like a similar pattern for like the higher level controllers, because like then the higher level workload creates the workload, and so the lower level one like just adopts it. That is the only drawback that I see is that it's a little bit cumbersome for the users. Like if they want to opt out and they want to opt out like gazillion of different like jobs, then it's not like the best user experience for them to like be forced to create this workload object. But I think like maybe for alpha it's good enough. The question is like if we decide later that we want like a little bit different mechanism, that will have to start as alpha and so on, so like it will delay us later potentially. So like I think it solves the problem. The question is if we can have something that is like more UX friendly.
Maybe that should be the effect of an opt-out, not the way users do it.
Maybe.
Then, one more thing, I think we should also discuss whether we need opt-out only on creation and whether also on like for existing workloads, right? I think this is something we should discuss. I think both would be nice, but yeah, I don't have like a strong understanding of like use cases to say for sure. So, but I can imagine a scenario where I want to like the real workload started with gang scheduling and I want to disable it for some reason. I know it doesn't work. I decide and it's better for me to go with the old path for some reason. So yeah.
The question is if it's like sorry for jumping ahead. The question is like if we have like a single one, then maybe recreating that job again, like one more, like again, is good enough. Then if I have gazillion of those that and all then want to opt out, then probably like disabling feature gate is still maybe at least temporarily. If we want to this like more longer term, it's not an option. Anyway, sorry for jumping ahead.
Audrey?
Yeah, I think on the job discussion topic, I like the idea of disabling it via owner reference. If you all agree with this, we can talk about it in the cap. I want to kind of like I saw you made some changes, Matt, in the proposal for beta promotion, right? so if we introduce, I guess like the final decision was to keep the pod group template, right, in the Workload API. So my question is, in the future, are we planning to introduce min count to pod groups, or are we still planning to managing min count on the template side in the future versions?
So even if in this version, right, like in the alpha version of pod group, the min count will be there because we are going with the inline model. So we'll be actually copying the policy from the pod group template to the instance of pod group.
So my question is, in the future, when we make this API mutable, like not right now, when we have this design, like are we planning to make it mutable on a workload object or in a pod group object?
I think
Because
both, right? Eventually both, yeah.
Both. So what is the then, I mean, how are we going to use the min count in a pod group and how are we going to use min count in a workloads API?
So the template is for creating new pod groups. Okay. So if I want to make sure I have some, I don't know, job set with replicated job, I want to add new instances of the job. So the min count in the template will be the min count used for the new jobs when the new pod group is created, right? And for existing jobs, the min count will be like the one that scheduler looks at will be the one from the pod group. So
yeah, but today pod group, if I remember correctly, doesn't have min count, right?
But
On the API.
that was the change from the end of the last week. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm trying to understand, like, okay, if we keep this as a template, right? Like, are we planning to make template mutable in the future? So this is not clear to me right now, right? Because this is not actually the template, right? Like which fields like we will go to the template part, which fields will go to the pod group object by itself.
So currently, like the pod group template, it contains a scheduling policy. I think that's the name of the field and of the struct. And this whole scheduling policy will be copied to the pod group. And scheduler will act the scheduling policy from the pod group. So,
So I think we
mean,
should
like
use the same pattern like with pod templates and pods. And
yes.
whatever is done there, we should apply it here. But
yeah, I guess like
Matt said it's our understanding.
Which means like all of the fields like preemption, resource claims, and other parameters we can introduce on a template, which will be applicable to the pod groups, right? So this is our goal, right? Like parameters like I don't know, like I think we have some of the API for node affinity, right? For topology for TAS. They will also be part of the pod group template API in the future, right?
Yes, if you are asking about like whether we will be able to or like the general mutability, I think that's open discussion, right? Because there is I think we see use cases where we need to change the min count, but I'm not sure whether we have a good use cases whether we need to change, I don't know, topology and like what is the expectation if I change topology of the like existing pod group, right? Should the pods be rescheduled to match the new topology? That's like bigger discussion.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, my feeling that, sorry, like driver. I just want to say, like, we discussed this a little bit with the job set integration. I feel like it will be use cases when, topology will be changed, especially when, folks want to reallocate their workloads to the available capacity. Like, for example, if you have a rack, like you want to have a high priority, inference workload you want to place there. And sometimes you might want to have flexibility of how you change the resource claims. So I would imagine in the future we might require, some mutability of these fields.
We can achieve that by saying like you cannot change the topology of existing pod groups. You should like create a new pod group template and new pod groups with new topology, right?
Yeah.
That's the solution. But again, like we need to discuss it. I'm not saying I have answers for this now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. One more thing. Sorry, just remembered it now. I think related to the resource claim. Thank you, Andrea, for reminding me with that. So the resource claim, as we agreed, I removed it from the pod group API cap, and John, thank you, he included it in the whole end-to-end scenario, or the end-to-end use case for the DRA. So he assumed that we have the pod group API already, and he started to add the new field, or the new field, which is the resource claim, to the pod group, and the whole KEP will be end to end for the DRA. So John, please go ahead if you would like to discuss anything related to that.
Yeah, so I guess one point I would like to make with that PR or with that KEP is that the point is not to like introduce some concept of like dependencies between resource claims and that sort of thing. It's entirely focused on like a resource claim being allocated for a whole pod group all up versus each individual pod. And then also being able to like replicate shared resource claims where like the pods in a pod group all share a resource claim, but then that resource claim gets copied for each instance of a pod group. So overall, the whole idea of like affecting which pods get scheduled onto which nodes is not really a focus of that KEP in particular.
Yeah, it's about resource claim lifecycle management along with pod groups. And I mean, there is a side effect. There can be a side effect, but that's not the focus. And then the other thing would be so I think we have a way now to specify dependencies between alpha gates. So like we could say this one's dependent on pod groups. So you have to have both enabled, for example. So it's basically just a layer on top that's a separate gate, so we don't have any coupling between the release dates of independent pod group and the resource claim lifecycle management on top of that.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Let me just. So I added a couple comments to that KEP like on Friday, but I didn't yet see if you managed to reply them. Like if there is anything that like sounded controversial, like maybe we can discuss it here, but I didn't yet get to like.
I think John revised it based on your comments, and you had wanted. I was saying let's do workload 2, and you didn't want to do that. That's fine. We don't have to do that. I was only thinking about the lifecycle management and not that it might have unintended scheduling side effects. I had one question in there about so the pod group creation only, right? The lifecycle creation deletion will be attached to, I'm sorry, the resource claim creation will be attached to the pod group creation. The allocation of the pod group level resource claims will happen still at first pod scheduling.
Yep, I agree.
You had a comment in there about the pod group becomes the scheduling, and I know there's the workload scheduling. I wasn't sure if what is the end vision? Would it be that allocation happens? Is there a separate pod group scheduling that it's sort of where that should be triggered rather than during pod scheduling, which we don't need to do in 136, but I'm just trying to understand
There is, so like we even as part of like 136, we are making like what we call workload scheduling cycle, which is like a little bit misleading because it should be called pod group scheduling cycle. But anyway, like the goal there is that we are taking pod group as a whole and doing the scheduling. It's still like in 136 we'll be building on top of like existing primitives, and like we effectively will be finding a placement for pods from that pod group like one by one. We just will not get into actuation of any of the decisions until we like compute everything and figure out like that like all the constraints can be matched for the pod group as a whole.
Okay, so then all we have to do is integrate. We don't have to do anything. We keep the existing claim allocation at pod scheduling time.
Right.
And your cycle will call into that code automatically as part of that process, and it'll just happen.
Right.
Awesome.
Right. So yeah. I think
we just need to register pod group instead of individual pod in the reserve for.
Yes.
But I think the rest will should work the same.
So I think, yeah, we are on the same page here, John. Like, I think, like, thanks for clarifying, but that's what I had on my mind, like, with my comment that it's about creation purely, and we leave like the allocation as it is now, like effectively.
And John already updated the cap on Friday to do that, so I think we're
Okay,
good.
perfect. Thank you. I will take
He
another.
did some stuff over the weekend too, which I haven't reviewed, so you might want to comment on that.
So I was curious for the job integration, are we gonna go with the beta gang scheduling integration, or are we going to have the job controller also create pod groups? Because like I guess like I was envisioning like we could go with whatever is going in beta, so that way the job controller only relies on a beta API being enabled, and then we can get that one out sooner rather than later. Or do we put the job controller integration like with creating pod groups, which ties it to an alpha API?
The later. We discussed this actually last time, and we decided to go with creating the workload API and the pod group API as well. Yes, it will be a little bit tricky because we have two feature gates now, or not, yeah, two feature gates and two different APIs, the beta and the alpha. But I believe it will be better for the next step, which is like build on top of the pod group. Otherwise, we will just like revamp the code again and like introduce the pod group next time.
Good.
But
So
please, I would like to hear everyone else view as well.
I guess that's fine with me. That, I guess, to me solidifies the point that for job set, I guess we should just wait until 1.36 is out to build an integration and kind of table that now. If like, because I don't, I mean, if I was thinking like we could try and GA gang scheduling earlier when like pod, because like, unless we're planning on like graduating both like workload and pod group together, which maybe that makes more sense. But I didn't know if like we were talking about like maybe graduating in the workload API first, and then we could couple the job work with that API going GA so that gang scheduling comes earlier. But it sounds like what we're saying is we should probably treat workload and pod groups as the graduation will most likely happen at the same time. In that case, if we want anyone to, I guess, use those APIs.
I think that very heavily depends on the discussion that like Matt brought up like earlier. It like what exactly we are because yeah, how exactly we are going to, and if we are going to graduate workload to beta this release, and like what exactly that means, and how pods will be referencing, because like depending on that decision, depending on our upgrade story for that and so on, like future story there, I think that is like the deciding factor whether or how easy and how feasible and what exactly the story will look like for upgrades in particular, and for changes. Like if we decide to integrate first only without the pod group, then like what it means for further releases, like do we have like an upgrade story and so on. So I think we need to wait for that decision, and based on that decide like if that makes sense to integrate with the workload without the pod group, or we should just start.
Yeah, actually, I have the same question. I'm wondering, so do we have a strong requirement to graduate workload API to beta in 1.36, right? Because in any case, if we're going to end up creating pod groups, right, for the controllers, like what is the main motivation for us to go to beta for workload?
Wojtek, do you want, because your hand is still.
I can, but like Eric, I think you have like crisper answer for that, so maybe you can go ahead. You are muted.
Yeah, mute, there you go.
I love the engagement that we have from Kevin and Andre and other workload owners, and I was concerned that if we move too slowly, like we'll lose your engagement. So I guess you're here. Are you going to lose interest if we take another cycle to get Gang to beta?
Yeah.
That's it's for you. We're appreciative you're here. What do you need?
Yeah, I guess for us, I mean, it really depends. I mean, Kevin, you can also, from your perspective, give your thoughts. But it looks like, for the job integration, we're still going to depend on the pod group, right? Like we might want to start with alpha integration, right, with the workload API and the pod group. On the other hand side, I feel like if we go workload to beta without having the pod groups, it will create additional, like we need to think about upgrades, right, in bundle 37. So that also will be really hard. And I don't really know like how many actually, workload owners seriously considering, this feature to be available. Because, like, yes, GAN scheduling is a must, right, for the majority of AI workloads. But right now, this still depends on, like on third-party tools like Q or Volcano, co-scaling plugins. I don't really expect from them to migrate a workload, as fast as they can. I understand, it is important for us to, find more adoption, but just want to understand, what will be the maintenance burden, right, if we don't do this properly. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm definitely not going to lose interest. I think right now we've kind of put the community in a little bit of a bad state where no one's probably going to invest effort on getting like co-scheduling. Like they're adopting the co-scheduling scheduler plugin because probably most people will be waiting for in-tree scheduling. So that was part of my interest for job set was because like we were getting requests for gang scheduling, and before this work came up, I was thinking maybe we should for job set start thinking of like a basically an API for adding in like pod groups through Volcano or the co-scheduler to kind of get gang scheduling in like for the job set folks. But I kind of I've like leader worker set added this maybe about 6 months ago, and I think now like that enhancing that API is kind of on hold because of entry gang scheduling. It's not as clear why we'd want to start supporting all the different external schedulers for gang scheduling anyway. But so that's where like I'm definitely interested in this. I think this is a path forward. I know that I guess John probably has some experience with like the DRA effort and how long that took. And like I feel like what we want to make sure when we have the API going to GA, we want it as robust as possible with and having the ability to build on top of it, I think goes a long way in like speeding up this effort. So I to me, I feel like it would make sense to like if you don't want to code around like the issues with workload graduating and pod group not graduating, I would say that a collective graduation probably makes the most sense because like we will have problems rolling this feature out and for people anyway. Like anytime we have an API, a new API in Kubernetes, it seems to be kind of painful for vendors to adopt them.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think there are counter arguments to like we are working on many different things, and like on top of that, like topology or scheduling, workload or preemption, like the more of that, this if we postpone beta and then GA of the workload API, we will effectively end up in a situation when all of them, and maybe even more of those, will be enabling by default in exactly the same release, which is like pretty risky, I think, because there will be too much. So I think like it's also about risk reduction, but it's like it's a very hard trade-off, and like ideally from the API perspective, I agree. I would also like to like wait and have a clear API from the very beginning. That's why we are still trying to figure out like if we have a clear upgrade story and like how exactly it would like and like how the API in the end will look like so that it's not polluted like with things that we don't need longer term and so on. So like I think it's the top priority for like the next couple of days to figure it out. Eric?
I think handling large scale training where you have multiple, you want to be able to fail one topology domain, but still keep going, because that's not exactly like a single gang. And dealing with like separate disaggregated inference where you have separate, counts for decode and prefill. We really haven't, I don't feel like we've nailed those down. We're gonna regret whatever decision we make, we're probably going to regret at least some part of it with those. So I'm not very optimistic about the idea of landing everything that's needed for all AI workloads in one big bang. There has to be some amount of iterative work here, because no one can wrap their head around all the parts. So I'm not sure what that means, other than I don't think we're going to get it perfect and not end up with some fields that we're like, oh, we didn't need that.
Yeah, and that to me is kind of, that's sort of what I saw from the DRA work, was that eventually there was a point to kind of get the API graduated, start getting vendors using it, and there are still there are still things that people are adding to the DRA API. So I don't necessarily think we have to solve I view the features and the API graduation are kind of different, almost. Like, in order for people to start using it, the API needs to be beta or GA anyway. For most people to start adopting it. I know I'll speak from my employer would probably not want to would not even, like, GA is usually our bar for new APIs. And sometimes, feature gates even get a little risky there. So I expect we have a long road ahead of us for this, but at least focusing on getting I understand it's always hard, and the DRA keeps growing, the features keep growing, but I think over time it's helpful to add features rather than kind of collate everything and release it all at once.
Yeah, I think that definitely our experience was like even getting the core. So there's a couple things. One is new APIs like Workload and Pod Group are, even once they're beta, nobody uses them because they're not default on beta. So you need to enable them. Obviously you can get people to use them, but it's not all that much easier than alpha. The APIs have to be enabled, the feature gates have to be enabled, and it's not by default. So it's still kind of like a conscious choice people have to make. Definitely people are more willing to make a conscious choice on beta than alpha, though. So there's that. I think that the main thing is like finding something that's coherent and functionally complete that can be released. Is that the Workload API, when we know that the way the pod groups are managed is really different? And are we putting where's the friction? If the goal is like getting something functionally complete out into GA as soon as possible, is getting this piece to beta first and then having to write code to handle the two different ways these fields are interpreted and the upgrade paths and migration paths. Like, is that extra work? Does that defeat the purpose of doing it early? I don't know the answer to that question, but those are the things I would try to answer.
That's exactly what we are trying to figure out now. Yes.
You're muted, Eric.
I'm just trying to think what it would look like to just deliver gang scheduling for job and maybe for job set if it wants to treat it as one gang. So that would mean like you would have to treat Workload with a single, if it has a single pod group template in it, list item, and that list item asks for gang, you have to treat that the same as this future desired pod group state, and you have to carry that forward forever. If we're willing to carry that one wart, which would be like, we'll call it a single gang scheduling only workload, with one item is forever supported as a degenerate form of pod group, then we can like move forward now, and we can make a lot of people happy. Should we carry that wart? I don't know. I think we're all like agree that like LWS is going to be messy if we try to handle it with the current design. So I'm not advocating. So I think that is going to have to wait, unfortunately. Really, the main question is, do we carry a wart to put it, kind of move something to beta? I'd be interested. How about, can you run a poll? I don't know. Maybe we could take a poll in the room.
I think there's also the opportunity cost. What's the opportunity cost of devoting resources to implementing a wart, managing a wart, and managing migration between the I don't even the analogy falls apart, but the metaphor falls apart. But you know what I mean? Like what it is effort, right? It's not free to have the wart.
Right. But like we have
like,
a lot of like we have volumes are inline or managed by PVCs, right? It's not. There's other examples. You can find multiple examples in Kubernetes where sometimes it's like embedded in an object and sometimes it's somewhere else.
That's true.
And it has happened as we've evolved the system that you need to like take something that's embedded in an object and later pull it out.
Right.
I don't know.
But I think that predates, like, I think we first made a decision to like graduate like inline volumes and so on, like inline, and only then figure out like all the problems. Now we are already aware of the problems, so we know that we will have this other pattern, which wasn't the case like for volumes. So, but I think
the problem
sure, like, going.
We can do a poll of this group, but I think honestly the people we need, and maybe they're here, some of them, like this is a platform piece, and it's the downstream controllers that are going to use it, and they're the ones who are going to have to deal with interpreting it. So like that's to me, it's actually like the question is for the clients of this API, not for the authors of the API to make that.
Exactly. I fully agree. And the second part is like, I think it's like, I'm not sure we are ready for this poll, because like by voting yes or no as a controller owner, you are not really yet sure what exactly you are signing up for. So like we need to flesh out the story, the full story, and then based on that we can potentially run this poll to decide like if you as a like controller author, like you are willing to take this additional burden or not.
Kevin?
So I guess to me, maybe so from the job set side, DRA and Taz are, I think we're going to need the pod group support, it sounds like. I don't have great visibility into whether or not Taz and DRA are critical over gang scheduling or not, because people tend to kind of conflate the two. Like I see a lot of use cases internally where, gang scheduling and topology aware scheduling are kind of one and the same almost for a lot of AI ML workloads. So, and probably people that are more large scale hyperscalers might know where that fits in priority. To me, like that's sort of what I'm trying to piece together. Please go ahead, Eric. You're on mute.
In my opinion, job and job set could have Taz without us doing pod group.
Maybe Taz, but not DRA, right?
In my opinion, most people are going to use label-based Taz first, and DRA will take longer to adopt. John, I'm wishing you the very best of luck, but that's my guess as to how the order people are going to adopt it. Everyone's seen label-based in Volcano and Q. They know how it works.
Right.
It'll be the first thing.
I actually, yes, that's yeah. We're going to have a sort of, anyway, it doesn't matter. We're going to have a DRA-based Taz based on what's shipping today. I think. But it'll get better with pod group.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It gets better with pod group, but like that, like, can I run a 50 pod job with TAS and use GPUs? That does not require a pod group object. That's doable today because it's doable today in Q, which uses a single workload object. Therefore, by extension, it's doable today with a single workload object that we have.
Right, but then you have to ask so this is the other question, is like, the part of what we're trying to do here is take functionality from things that are built over the top right now and build them down into the scheduler. And that means the problems are kind of already solved over the top. Now they're not solved for everybody because not everybody wants to run Q and not everybody wants to run Volcano, and like the workload, every workload integration may not be there, things like that. But like, if we're pushing these down into the platform, like, is the urgency there? It's not like people can't do it today at all. They have other ways to do it. So why the urgency to make the beta available, I guess, is the question, until we're sure it's right.
So the one thing that I would say is not solved really is like like an API for multiple pods sharing the same resource claim for like job, and then also like that is something that has come up in job set and leader worker set, especially in the working group device management. And I don't feel like we've ever had a great answer. Like no one's added API like DRA APIs into like workload APIs yet. And then Q doesn't really, I don't think Q is going to work very well if someone's trying to share the same resource claim across multiple pods. So to me, like that's one thing that I don't think is solved, or I don't know anyone that's
Right.
really thinking.
Yes, you're right. But if we're doing it for gangs, that wouldn't be solved by the workload release either. That's solved by the workload release to beta would solve the gang scheduling problem. So the question is whether solving it upstream in a different way 4 months earlier is worth it, right? As opposed to I can't answer that question, but that's, to me, the crux of it is like, what's the path for what's the incremental effort and lost opportunity for implementing it twice and asking downstream controllers to implement it twice, and who's going to use it right away in those first 4 months.
I mean, people found one bug already in the gang skill implementation while it's alpha. I assume there's more. Good to, I don't know. Someone will use it. Someone will use it seriously and send us useful bug reports. So I guess that's one advantage. I mean, I think I look at Q's workload object and it is pretty wordy, but like that doesn't seem to, people are much more focused on like what the higher level properties of the system are than the API. I think features matter more than beautiful APIs. We're more biased to like them because we have to write them.
Yeah, I mean, so for Q, the reason why no one complains about it is probably because we in Q do not, like, we actually don't record. Users do not interact with the workload API. It's handled by an in-tree controller for Q. So most of like the translation layer is kind of hidden from users. So most people don't pay much attention to it. There has been some requests in Q to add like more like placement level kind of policies to the workload object that we're trying to understand what that means in the workload aware scheduling approach, because that's gonna not age well, I think, if people are adding like labels or annotations to set the Q workload scheduling decisions, but the workload aware scheduling is doing them slightly different. That's something we're trying to figure out in Q, but that's why I think there's not much complaints about the API, is because it's completely hidden from users. They create a job and the Q workload is created under the hood and people don't usually interact with it. So, but anyway. I did have one question in chat. I feel like it sounds like we all agree that there needs to be a decision made on this. I'm just curious where that will be made. I don't know what KEP these conversations are happening on, or docs or anything. Could we like maybe bring it to the channel so we kind of know?
Yeah, we will publish. There is a doc that we started with Matt like earlier today, but like the decision maker, the ultimate decision maker, I'm assuming it's Tim Hawking, like from the API approval perspective. So I'm happy to drive those discussions. Like we will definitely like publish this document like tomorrow-ish morning or something like that, or tomorrow-ish morning your time. So that like you like, and we are happy to like get any feedback. But I'm assuming like that we don't have a decision maker in this room even because of this being the API decision.
Your doc's going to list a couple alternatives and recommend one, and anyone in this call is going to have a chance to say, yeah, I like the one you picked, or why didn't you look at this? Why not this one? And then how long before that goes to, and then that's not going to go to Tim for a couple of days, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that Tim mentioned like either late this week or early next week, like he will get back to it.
So I guess that makes a little unclear what to do with all the KEPs, if whether or not we will be having a release exception for some of these.
No, so I think that there are effectively two options here. Like either I think the two high-level options are we either stay with alpha for Workload API, and then like we know what to do. Like everything moves like the Workload API moves. Like we are just not graduating to beta. We are just changing the requirements, changing that, like adjusting the fields and so on as planned. Or we will figure out like a plan how to make it beta in a acceptable enough way. And then like, yes, it will be short on time, but like we still should be able to make it before the freeze, assuming like we will get some consensus for what we are recommending to team, and like having that decision like late this week, early next week. Early next week, I mean pretty Monday-ish. So that should still be possible. Although like tight on schedule, yes.
Eric? Eric?
Or me?
Okay, Dominic. Yeah.
So there is one risk if we have separate prod groups, and if we don't implement it on time, this release, then we will not be able to promote to beta next release. There is always such a risk. So promoting to beta the Workload API, like it's a little bit safer from this perspective. We don't have much time to even KEP freeze, right?
Yeah, we have 2 weeks. 1 week technically, the PRR, I guess stuff has to be complete by either Wednesday or Thursday this week, and then
not 2 weeks, no. Less than about 10 days. Less than 10 days.
well, yeah, the PRR deadline, I think.
Yeah.
So new KEPs try and
So is the only difference is that like from the scheduler perspective, we would have to wait for podgroup object to be created instead of waiting for workload object to be created.
Right.
So that's not a big difference, I think. It's code-wise, I think it's something.
Yeah, it's pretty small change code-wise. I think it's.
So
I mean,
so KEP
the
would
API
be...
itself is like always adding new API. It's not like a small change, but like it's relatively straightforward what needs to happen there if we figure out the right API.
Okay, so the risk maybe it's not that big actually.
From scheduling perspective, no, it's not big.
Like at least for 136, right? Because
Yeah.
eventually we need to have a story about converging those two APIs, right? There with podgroups, without, and this will get more tricky once we get more features like tasks, etc. Right? So
Yeah.
Like for 136, yes, I think code-wise it shouldn't be big change.
From scheduling perspective, no, it's not in general, and for scheduling, yeah, I listed all the changes. It's not that big.
And if I understand correctly, the discussion about workload reference is exactly the same issue. So
it is, yeah, obviously. Like we need to take into account also like the perspective of controller integrators and also scheduler owners, right? Because it will impact the decision that we make there. It will impact everyone.
But I think like regarding the risk, I think like strictly speaking, I would say that the risk is much higher that we will not miss some of the changes from the core KEP, like the Gantt scheduling KEP, and like the changes there are much bigger and much more tricky. And like I'm personally more worried about that part than like not being able to handle the podgroup itself.
So the options we're waiting for: having the workload API going to beta and podgroup in alpha. Second thing, both of them will be alpha in 1.36. Any other? There is nothing.
There are
These
sub options in the first one, but yes.
Yeah, I had a couple of ideas, but I don't know if from API perspective if they are like legit or not. Like having the pod group and the beta, but in default like full default like like all the options.
Yep.
So
Yep.
of course you will discuss all of them. Okay. So yeah, hopefully we will get answer for this. And until this point, okay, I'm a mom, so I just like I cannot concentrate, like with this. So yeah, until this we have these KEPs. Maybe we can just like work on them to get them as ready as possible. So if we get a decision, we can merge them or get them merge them together or merge them individual. Okay. I think that's it. Anything else to discuss? Perfect.
I guess no. Thank you, Heba, for leading the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Helpful.
Everyone,
Thank you.
Bye.